Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. Today I want to talk about why Kyle Rittenhouse would still be in a lot of trouble if he was Canadian. And I know I've done a lot of Rittenhouse content. This is probably going to be the last of those videos. I swear the next video is going to be something non-Rittenhouse. But this case has given us an opportunity to look at some of the differences between Canadian and American judicial systems. In particular, there's a lot of things that Canadians often get wrong because we watch American TV. We get a lot of our notions of how the court works from that. And so this is a good opportunity to see one of those distinctions. So one thing people often ask me about is about double jeopardy. People ask me about this with respect to the Cahill trial. So Canada does have a double jeopardy rule, but it's different from the one in the States. Because Kyle Rittenhouse was acquitted at trial, he simply can't be charged again. He's done. In Canada, the rule is a little different. So this is from the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which notes, any person charged with an offense has the right, and then subsection H says, if finally acquitted of the offense, not to be tried for it again, and if finally found guilty and punished for the offense, not to be tried or punished for it again. Finally is the key word. That's the word that would cause Rittenhouse a lot of trouble here, because an acquittal doesn't become final until the appeals are exhausted, either because the Crown has chosen not to appeal it, or the defense, if it was a conviction, or because they've been unsuccessful at some level of appeal and their further appeals have been denied, or they were unsuccessful at the Supreme Court. So if we look at what happened in the Cahill trial, he was acquitted at trial, and then that was appealed up all the way to the Supreme Court, and now the Supreme Court has directed a new trial. That's permitted under the Canadian system because he hasn't yet been finally acquitted. However, let's say he wins again at this new trial. There's nothing to say that it's in turn can't be appealed. Now, there are reasons why this is different. The Canadian Charter is a young document as compared to the United States Constitution. And in fact, they were looking at the United States experience when they drafted the Charter. One rationale is that it allows for the correction of judicial errors. If somebody's acquitted and this results from a mistake, the judge made some sort of error in the law, well, then that can be corrected on appeal. You can go back and order a new trial, or in some cases, they might actually substitute a conviction where an acquittal had earlier resulted. This can also happen with jury verdicts, but the test for that is way higher, and that's because we don't want to tamper lightly with jury verdicts. Now, it's also sometimes noted, that they're saying that this evens out the playing field because they say, listen, defense gets to appeal, so the prosecution should get to appeal too. It is, however, worth considering that the playing field is not quite even. And the reason for that is that the Crown has effectively unlimited resources. The Crown is never going to run out of money in order to appeal something. They've got the budget for it, especially on a high-profile case. Whereas the accused is paying for things out of their own pocket in most cases. So they have to find the money for this. They have to find the money for the initial trial, then for the appeals, then for a retrial, then maybe for more appeals. And so an accused can easily have their funds run down and their ability to defend themselves run down through this process. That's not exactly a fair and level playing field when you think about it. So a lengthy and drawn out process actually provide or weights things towards the Crown. That gets to be a really big problem if we're looking at a case that is highly politicized, something like the Rittenhouse trial. I've watched every second of the Rittenhouse trial, and I am 100% convinced that this is a really clear case of self-defense. I know lots of people argue this is controversial, but frankly, I think that it's very difficult to justify when you've seen all of the evidence that was tendered at the trial. Problem is that people are getting their information filtered through the news media, which presents a fairly biased and lopsided account. And so a lot of people are thinking that this is an unfair verdict because they're not seeing the full picture, or because they possibly don't understand the legal principles that are at play. But, and it's so much so that, in fact, it's difficult to see why this case was even brought in the first place, other than the political considerations, other than the fact that Rittenhouse is an unpopular kid to many people, and so they wanted to bring these charges and in order to show that they were doing something. Well, if they could, they'd probably appeal it for the same reasons, and I'm sure Rittenhouse's defense has been incredibly expensive. Well, an appeal would be expensive as well, and so on. So it might end up being a situation where he ends up, or if he were Canadian, he'd be ending up going back to a trial and the money's not there anymore. And all of the people who donated, via crowdfunding to support him, maybe they're less keen on it now because of the passage of time, or just they've already been tapped out. And what's he going to do? The prosecution, of course, still fully bankrolled. And yeah, it's a real problem in that sense. So when we look back to the Cahill matter, Cahill's matter is also getting somewhat politicized. And I can't say that it's been politicized to the same degree as the Rittenhouse trial, but I'm certainly seeing a lot of, op-eds and so forth talking about, the trial and basically trying to spin it up into some sort of cause célèbre. So this is a bit of an issue here. And, I hope Mr. Cahill is able to fund a full and complete defense again, because he's going back for another trial. Anyway, that's one consideration in terms of how things would play out differently if Kyle Rittenhouse was Canadian. Different double jeopardy rules would mean he wouldn't be done yet. He'd still be locked in the court processes. Another thing is, in fact, and I've been mentioning Mr. Cahill, well, the Supreme Court decision that just came out on that would really impact this, and basically says that the jury has to look at the complete totality of the circumstances around the event. Now, I do owe you guys a proper Cahill video, and it's coming. But one of the things that the Supreme Court was concerned about when trying to determine how to do this is the possible worry that a jury might look at somebody who's doing something lawful but disapproved of, and use that as a reason to find that their self-defense was no longer justified. Essentially saying, listen, we don't like you, and so you don't get to defend yourself. Well, I kind of feel that that would have been very applicable in this case. And the court said basically, listen, we need to make sure that the jury doesn't do that. But how are you going to do that when you're also telling them, listen, in order to evaluate the reasonability, you have to look at everything going around in the circumstance. So I suspect that what you'd be seeing is a lot of the reasoning that the Supreme Court was specifically concerned about in this particular case. So the self-defense rules in Canada, notwithstanding the fact that they haven't really changed, the jury instructions are likely to have changed in a way that would make Mr. Rittenhouse's defense a lot more difficult. So that would be a problem in that sense. The third issue for this is one that doesn't really, it's not confined to Mr. Rittenhouse. It's actually a societal issue, which is that here in Canada, we have developed this tendency where we respond to unpopular acquittals by changing the law. And so after Ghomeshi was acquitted, they changed the law to limit what evidence can be tendered to defend against certain crimes, which I'm not going to name because this is a YouTube video and YouTube doesn't like that all that much. After the Stanley trial, they changed the rules in terms of how jurors are selected in order to eliminate peremptory challenges. So now it becomes more difficult to ensure that your jury doesn't include people who are possibly hostile to your client. Now, this was offered as something, in terms of establishing equality and, a level playing field between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. However, this was an unpopular trial and it had this sort of racial dimension to it, at least in the media spin. But ultimately, my read on what the impact of this is that it's going to be negative for Indigenous Canadians. They tend to be disproportionately targeted by the justice system. And so if something makes it harder to select a fair jury, that's going to have much more impact, especially if you happen to be a member of a group, say, like Indigenous Canadians, that might be subject to prejudice. If you're trying to keep prejudiced people off your jury, this is a tool that used to be available and now no longer is. So I'd be very concerned what would happen if something similar to the Kyle Rittenhouse situation happened here in Canada. I'd expect that they would actually go and tinker with the laws, and most of these tinkering with the laws don't actually produce good results. They actually have negative consequences. I have long said that, any law that is named for a dead person is probably a bad law, and laws make terrible memorials. They're not a good way to memorialize somebody. These laws that we pass because we're angry or upset tend to be real bad laws. And so I'd be very concerned for what sort of thing they might pass here if this were to happen. In fact, this still might happen because Canada, we look to the States a lot. We get a lot of our news from the States. I'm a Canadian and I'm watching the Rittenhouse trial and I'm really interested in it. But the problem that sort of generates is that sometimes we respond to American incidents. So it's hard to say as to whether or not we're going to escape from this one without getting some sort of law that is effectively a response to this. When we have two countries with different ways of doing things, it can raise the question of which is the better system. Now, on the double jeopardy question, I can't really answer that one for certain. There's obviously cases where I'm just glad that the case is over and done with and there's a final result. But sometimes in the Canadian system, there's people who, they get an acquittal and that acquittal was essentially a wrongful acquittal. It was based on an error and they end up going to custody and doing time because that gets corrected. It's tough to say which one you value more, and that's ultimately a big societal question. But in the specific case here of Kyle Rittenhouse, I think that it would result in an injustice. That doesn't mean that there aren't injustices corrected by the Canadian system as well. So it's a real tough question. Let me know in the comments below what you think. I mean, keep in mind that for every person you like that ends up sort of getting the benefit of this, there might be many more people who you don't like who get the benefit of it. And conversely, with the other system, the Canadian system, it might work the other way around. So it's a real tough question here. Now, I've got a number of things that I want to do videos on quite quickly here, all of which are non-Rittenhouse. Let me know in the comments which one you want me to get to first, because there's a whole bunch of them. I just went and shot the Desert Brutality shooting competition, so I've thought about doing a video on that. I owe you guys a video on the second half of Ward, the Ward decision about the Canadian comedian. There's also the Cahill decision. There's potentially other stuff as well. So let me know if there's something that you want me to prioritize, and I'll try to get that out sooner rather than later. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like this video. Please share it with your friends. Subscribe to see more content. It really is important for the channel, which is why you get these messages. I also want to thank my Patreon supporters, and you guys, help keep this all going. So at the $50 level, Jonathan Wheeler, Canada's National Farms Association, Mike, Kyle Martin, Jean-Guy Toussaint, the CCFR, and the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. At the $30 level, Sights and Arms Limited and Marc-Olivier Damour. And at the $20 level, Raymond Dale McKinnon, Matt Ward, Mark Whittington, Jane Babin Luxor, Dale Nesbitt, Cameron Johnson, Bruno R., Andrew Elsich, and Aaron Del Salt. Thank you as well to the $10 supporters who will be in the crawl immediately following. And thank you for watching. I hope this has armed you with knowledge. See you next time.